Chapter 2 then. So as we move through chapter 2, keep in mind those principles that we learned yesterday in chapter 1 in how to divide the words up in order to be able to look at the word roots, prefixes, suffixes, and then the combining vowels in order to then come up with the meaning of those words. So chapter 2 is where we're first going to get into looking at medical terms that are pertaining to specific issues that we're going to be learning about as far as the body. So chapter 2 starts on page 19 of your textbook. So if you're not there yet, go ahead and jump into that section. And the first part of today's lecture will follow the text as far as talking about the human body and the organization of it, and then just some other basic body types of terms that we'll be discussing. And then the second or last part talks about a lot of the oncology types of terminology and procedures, which has to do with relation to cancer. Cancer is a huge issue in healthcare, and it doesn't really fit into any of the systems specifically. So they added it to this chapter. So it kind of seems a little bit out of place. It could almost be its own chapter, but they kind of threw it into chapter 2 here. So if you're kind of wondering about that, that's how it's placed. So if you look at this slide, this is walking us through basic organization of the human body. And if you've taken any type of bio class in high school or introductory bio classes in college, it would show you this type of breakdown. And we see that starting from the most basic form of the cell, which is the basic unit of life, all the way up through the system, we have increasing complexity. And you can basically look at it from the cell, that's your basic unit. You put a group of cells together and that creates a tissue. The tissue is able to perform a specific function. If you put multiple tissues together that all perform that specific function, then you get an organ, and the organs come together then to make systems. So up in the top right-hand corner, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not when I do that, but up here in the top right-hand corner, it says CTOS or CTOS. And it's going to be on several of the next slides as a reminder that when we are thinking about how are we putting all of these terms together and how is the body being composed, think about basic level cells, tissues, organs, and then systems. So that CTOS acronym hopefully will help you remember cell, tissue, organ, system just by simply looking at those words. So looking at the body cells, and you'll note that up here, we still have CTOS up in the corner. So that's going to remind us cell, tissue, organ, system. But the cell, basic unit of life, it is composed of a cell membrane. So that's what is composing the cell, keeping it all inside. The cytoplasm, which is inside of the cell membrane, it's essentially the juices inside of the cell that are holding all of the other components. And then inside of that, centrally located, we have the nucleus, which contains the chromosomes and all of the basic computing information of that cell, telling it what to do and what it's going to become as it continues to grow. And so here's kind of an example of what that looks like. You can see the outside wall being the membrane, inside cytoplasm, and then nucleus inside of that. And then inside that nucleus, we have chromosomes. And those chromosomes are what's holding all of our, like DNA, for example, that's the information packet of the cell. That ultimately determines what that cell is going to be. So that's not only information in telling it what to do, but it's telling it what to become as it grows and then replicates into different types of tissue, and then ultimately what type of organ and what type of system it's going to contribute to. Looking a little bit more at the chromosomes, 46 in all human cells except for the mature sex cells, which only have 23. They only have 23 because they're eventually going to pair up with another sex cell from the opposite sex in order to make a full cell of 46, which will then, of course, replicate and grow into a full-sized human being. Genes are the regions within the chromosome. So we kind of started with cell and then we went big. So cell, tissue, organ, system. And then we go back to cell and then we look at chromosome and we're going smaller. And then we look at gene, which is a portion of the chromosome, which is even smaller. And then you can look at the DNA, which is composed up inside of that gene. So we kind of went from little to big and then back to little again with cell and then went even smaller. And it's not imperative that you guys understand specifically what all of these things do or how they work. This is just a very broad overview in order so that as you're going through some of these medical terms, you can sort of place them in the bigger scheme of things. So then moving back up through tissues, again, that's a group of cells, as we've discussed before. A couple different types of tissues are listed there: muscle, nervous, connective, and epithelial, along with their descriptions. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. Then moving past tissues, multiple tissues make up organs. Main organs of the body are listed there. These are the big ones that you would think about: heart, brain, liver, stomach, lungs. And then when we go up to systems, so for example, you think about the heart, you think about cardio or cardiovascular. But when we actually talk about the cardiovascular system, then we're taking the heart and then we're adding other tissue components to it, or other organ components to it, excuse me, in order to make full systems. So a cardiovascular system would be the heart plus all of the veins as well, and the capillaries, the arteries that go into that to make the cardiovascular system. So you can see how we have this progression from small to large in making up the human body. So this is listed on page 20 of your text, talking about the different systems and the definitions for all of those. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of those. Most of them are pretty common sense at this point for adults. If you say respiratory system, you think, oh, that's something to do with the lungs. Urinary system, something to do with the bladder, the urethra. Obviously different components with male and female. Same goes for the reproductive system. But then digestive system, stomach, intestines, even up to the saliva and the mouth are part of the digestive system, and so on with those. And again, here, not the goal of this course to give you specific detailed information about all of these systems, but just to sort of cover them in an overview so that when we talk about them in terminology, we have that reference. Other parts of the body. So we've talked about sort of the tissues and the systems, but then we have cavities of the body. So these spaces in our body that are seemingly void or empty of cells, tissues, organs, or systems, or that contain those cells, tissues, organs, and systems. So listed there in page 21 of your book, that's where this figure comes from. But we could see several of the different cavities. Cranial cavity, of course, that's holding the brain. That connects with the spinal cavity that is holding your spinal cord. And of course, those two things together help make up the nervous system. Thoracic cavity, you're going to have your heart, your lungs, the mediastinum, which is the area that is in between the lungs that holds the heart, and the aorta that goes down and pumps the blood then to the rest of the body from the heart. Abdominal cavity, obviously there you've got your stomach and your intestines, things like your appendix, and even your bladder. And then down in the lower extremities, we see that there are no cavities down there. It's all muscle, bone, and connective tissue. So finally, we get to some different terms. So just flipping one page over to page 23. And by no means are these the only terms that could be found for this section, but these are common terms that you'll see to describe these things. You will always, if you're working in healthcare, run across terms that you are unfamiliar with and have to look them up for the most part. But if you understand how to break the word apart using the principles we learned yesterday, then you'll have to look less stuff up, because you'll just simply be able to look at the word and say, oh, this means inflammation of this organ, system, tissue, bone, joint, whatever it happens to be. So that will provide you a benefit there. But looking at these combining forms of body structure. So the first one there, that aden or adene. So if we add the O to it, that combining vowel, we get the combining form, which then would be adeno or adeno. You will hear it pronounced both ways, either adeno or adeno, site O, and then just going down the list, I'm not going to review all of them. If you do listen to the audio file that's listed under each chapter in the Moodle course, there will be a lecture going through this where they say all of these words. Do know that based on the region that you live, as well as the country that you might be living in, some of these words may be pronounced slightly differently, or there may be different word and different meaning combinations. So again, this is a sort of North America, United States version. But if you do go, for example, to Canada over on the East Coast, where there's a lot more French, or if you go to Europe, you're going to be seeing some slightly different combinations, or maybe even some different words to mean different items. But the nice thing is, if most of these words come from the Latin and Greek classical languages, that has all filtered through most of the European languages as well. And so therefore, a lot of them are similar. Here we see just the continuation of the combining forms. And what we'll see with some of these look somewhat familiar, such as onc for oncology. So most people have heard of an oncologist, referring to a doctor for cancer. Same thing with carcino, so like a carcinogenic. Most people know that cigarettes are carcinogenic, meaning that they cause cancer. But then things like that ET and EDO, the definition of that is being the cause of a disease. So if someone had lung cancer, we would say, what is the etiology? And etiology then would be the studyology of eti, meaning the cause of the disease. So what's the study of the cause of that lung cancer? And in a lot of cases, we see that that is smoking. And so this patient has cancer or is smoking a carcinogen, and therefore the etiology of their cancer is that cigarette that they had. GNO for know or knowledge, that comes from a Latin word gnostis, G-N-O-S-T-I-S, iater, I-A-T-R, it's a weird kind of word there, but when we use the combining form, it's iatero, and it means physician or medicine. And one word we'll see a couple slides from now is iaterogenic, which means that genic, genesis, it comes from the word genesis, meaning that the cause of what happened is due to the physician or the doctor or the hospital or the medicine, meaning that someone basically got or had something done to them that caused whatever they had. So if you're not sick and you go to the hospital, and because you're at the hospital, then you get sick, that would be considered iaterogenic, because you got sick as a result of being at the hospital, getting medicine, seeing the physician, etc. You could also say that if the physician was to cut into you and to pull out a tumor, if you had a tumor in your arm, they cut in and they took that out, that cut would be iaterogenic, because the physician is what caused that. Now, in that case, it's a good thing, in the case where you go to the hospital and get sick, that would be a not good thing. Most of the time we talk about iaterogenesis or iaterogenic from a negative standpoint. The text goes on and gives us some combining forms that describe color. Some of these are pretty basic, like chlor, think chlorophyll, like in all plants have chlorophyll. So we probably all learned that in, I don't know, 4th or 5th grade, maybe science class, learning about chlorophyll, and maybe, or maybe not, made the connection that chlor means green. So chloro, when we add the combining vowel to it to make the combining form green. Chrome just means color. So interesting, like a lot of people have Chromebooks or Google Chrome, the internet browser, and their little logo is that circle with a bunch of the different colors in it. Chrome is just a root for meaning all color. Cyan, blue, urethra for red, such as erythrocyte. So we know, or maybe we don't know, a couple slides back, it said cyte, meaning cell, and then ureth, meaning red. So we add the combining vowel to get erythrocyte in order to be a red blood cell. Same thing for this next term for white blood cells or leukocyte. So we have leuc, meaning white, and then cyte, meaning cell, leukocyte. And so we can start to see how some of these words are going to build together. Some prefixes that are commonly used to describe our body: dia, dis, hyper, hypo, meta, neo, pro. There's really not an easy way to figure out, okay, what do each of these words mean other than just common usage of it and to some extent memorizing them. So this is an example where, again, flashcards are going to come in very helpful to understand how it's being used. And when you make a flashcard, I wouldn't just put the prefix and the meaning on it, but I would put the prefix, the meaning, and then also an example of a word that it's used in. Because for me, if I look at dia, D-I-A, and it just says through and complete, I could memorize that, but it doesn't help me apply it. Like it doesn't really help me to learn it until I can apply it. So I need to train my brain, not just teach it. You know, memorization is great, I'm getting the information, but until I actually train and apply it, it doesn't stick for me. So I would think of a word, and the word that most comes to mind is just a very common word, diameter. So if I see diameter, it's basically meaning through or complete. And if we think about a circle and we say, well, the diameter is the length from one side of the circle to the other, that makes sense. It goes through the circle or it completes through the circle in order to explain diameter. Same thing for the rest of these. So dis, D-Y-S, just meaning something that is not correct. Okay, so if we take the word dysphagia, phage means having to do with swallowing. And so dysphagia would mean an abnormal or difficult swallowing ability. Hyper, hypo, we use these a little bit more frequently in just common language, but in healthcare, we use them all the time in order to mean some, you know, hyper is more than and hypo would be less than. And depending on how you're using it, it could mean above, below, it could mean excessive or incomplete, like they're listing here. So those are very, very common. Neo is also a word that we're going to use a lot, meaning new. So we could say a neonate or neonatal, meaning a newborn. Natal is born, so neonatal would be newborn. If we said prenatal, that would be before birth. Or postnatal would be after birth. Another word that we will sometimes see in science is neogenesis. Again, genesis meaning basically creation, and then neo meaning new. So if we have neogenesis, we have a new creation of a cell. So we'll often say that we have a neogenesis of cells if a certain structure has, for example, you have a burn patient and then those cells need to reproduce, then that would be a neogenesis of those cells in order to complete that healing. And then suffixes, of course, we've got lots of suffixes as well. We looked at ik and os last week as far as pertaining to. We just mentioned site, that pertains to the cell. Genic, similar to genesis that we just talked about, producing or causing or originating, all of those. Logist, such as oncologist, so cancer, onc, O being the combining vowel, and then logist, meaning the one who studies or the physician, essentially. So when we talk about most of our physicians in healthcare, it's something ologist. So pulmonologist, pul meaning lungs, P-U-L-M, ologist meaning the physician, and same thing goes cardiologist, neonatologist, so a newborn doctor, okay, of the newborn babies, and so on and so forth. We see some other words moving down that list, like megaly, megaly meaning an enlargement. So very similar to what hyper was as a prefix, megaly can be as a suffix. So sometimes we'll see a little bit of crossover with both of those. I'll point out pathy, about 3/4 of the way down the list, meaning disease. We see pathy used a lot. So that's one that you're definitely going to probably not have to memorize because you'll just use it so much that you'll remember it. But for example, here we have pathy as a suffix, and we could say a word like homeopathy, which is gaining interest more so. It was kind of a hotter word 10 years ago as far as like non-chemical based medicine, or just using natural remedies to treat people. So a homeopathy would be an example of that. But then we have what's called a pathologist. And so there we see that this suffix pathy, that root of it, path, can also be used as a word root. And if we say pathologist, we take pathy, meaning disease, ologist, one who studies, so we get the one who studies the disease. And a pathologist is its own type of doctor who studies those types of items. So just a quick comparing contrast, we see a few other word roots that also have suffixes. So site, cyto, is the word root, and that is where the suffix site comes from. So we talked about erythrocyte being a red blood cell, but then you can also have a cytologist being someone who studies cells. That's their specialty. So again, pathy, patho, we've already discussed that. And then sarcoma is typically used as a suffix meaning a malignant tumor, and malignant means cancerous. Benign would be the opposite of that, a non-cancerous tumor. But we can also see that sarc is a word root as well, that's where that suffix comes from. So it's able to be used sometimes in different ways, depending on how it's presented, but most cases they have this similar meaning. Okay, so then we jump into sort of the second half of the section of this chapter 2, and that's looking at oncology types of terms. And that was going to start on page 29 of your text. And so here we see all kinds of terms, but the one thing they have in common is that ending of oma, so O-M-A. And that oma is what is presenting to us that oncological meaning, or a cancerous type of meaning. So in all of these cases, if we look at the word roots, that's going to help us to identify where the cancer is at. So let's see here. If we take a look at the rhabdos, so on the right-hand column towards the bottom, we see the rhabdo. The rhabdo, if we go back and we look that rab or rhabdo up, we see that it basically means of striated cells or striated tissue, which is typically what we're seeing in skeletal muscle tissue. So if we were to break those words apart, we would see that it's an oma or a sarcoma. So there's a cancer. If it's the sarcoma, it is a malignant cancer. So the rhabdomyoma, we're looking at that. We just know that it's a tumor, right, of some sort, but we don't know whether it's malignant or benign, cancerous or non-cancerous. It's just oma. But if we look at sarcoma, then we know that that rhabdomyosarcoma is actually a malignant tumor. And so therefore it's going to be cancerous and it's going to be causing the problems, whereas the benign tumor, just the oma, is not going to be spreading and causing the destruction in the body that the sarcoma is going to. And then we apply that to the rhabdo. So we know we have a tumor of some sort. So if it's just the rhabdomyoma, it's a tumor of the skeletal muscle tissue. If we have rhabdomyosarcoma, that means we have a malignant tumor of that striated muscle tissue. So now that we're into some actual medical terms, other than just learning like we did yesterday about how to go about looking at these medical terms, we can look at a pronunciation guide. And it's pretty simple. We'll go through a couple different steps on and that guide us through how do we do this, what are the rules for pronunciation. When all else fails, go back to Hooked on Phonics and pronounce it how it looks. Okay, that's last case resort. Otherwise, try to follow these guidelines. And remember that even with following these guidelines inside the hospital, you've got people calling and pronouncing things different dialects and just using different emphases in different areas. You know, they might have a long O instead of the short O and put emphasis somewhere else that you wouldn't. And so it sounds a little bit funny. Just remember that sometimes you're going to see that, but these guidelines that we'll go through are going to be fairly helpful. So this first one is what's called the macron. And that's where we get sort of that long vowel versus the short vowel sound. So the examples they give here, the first one being donate, there's that macron symbol over the O and over the 8. So if we were to then phonically reproduce this, it would be donate. So you don't pronounce it donate or donate, you would pronounce it donate because of where the macron is listed on that. Likewise, you wouldn't say donat, right? Based off of English, we know that if you put the E at the end after the vowel, then it makes it a long vowel. So we know that it's nate and not nat. However, when we look at it just sort of in its phonic form, we use that macron in order to help us pronounce it. Looking at a couple of the others, there you got that hepatoma. So because there's not a macron over the E, we would not say hepatoma. It would be hepatoma or hepatoma, hepatoma. Okay, so you might hear someone say hepatoma, hepatoma, or hepatoma, hepatoma. So that's where you're going to kind of get just a little bit of a difference in how people pronounce it, but it's not hepatoma, hepatoma. Okay, it's not that because we don't see the macron in that case. And then the rest of them there, they give you a couple different examples of the different vowels. So the E, the I, O, and U, and as those would be pronounced using the macron or the long vowel. Vowels with no markings, we've already mentioned that. They have the short sound, so the A becomes A instead of A. The E becomes E instead of E, and so on. Knowing where to put the emphasis sometimes can be tricky. The primary accent is indicated by the capital letters in the phonic version. So when we're looking at like pancreatitis, pancreati, that tie is where we're putting the emphasis on it, pancreatitis. When we say pancreatitis, that emphasis is on the tie. This again is where sometimes you will get the difference in regional pronunciation, because people will put emphases on different areas. You know, from a medical terminology standpoint, I would say, yes, this is very important. You got to know where to put all the pronunciation, and to be an expert in medical terminology, this is where you would be. Personally, from a standpoint of you guys are going to be going into a medical field, you're going to be using medical language. The emphasis is that you understand what the word means, not necessarily how you pronounce it. So if I was going to be a good medical terminology teacher here, I would be like, no, you have to pronounce it correctly every single time. You've got to know where the emphasis is. Plus, you've got to know the meanings and all of those things. I take a little bit of a bigger view from that, in that I need you to be able to apply this information in a safe and productive way in the healthcare setting. Do you pronounce it a little bit differently than someone else? Okay, that might make me a bad medical terminology teacher, but I'm okay with that. So I guess take that for what you will, but that's kind of my philosophy on that subject. So a quick review question, and if you guys have already looked at the PowerPoints that were posted online, try to shield your eyes from that right now, because it does have the answer on it. But if we look at these two terms here, which of the following is analyzed correctly using the principles that we looked at yesterday? We have the same word, melanocarcinoma, but we have them separated differently. And so we can see the word roots, we can see a suffix. Option A also is separating a vowel, where option should be B. Both of them are listed as option A for some reason here, but the bottom one does not separate the O as a vowel. So just show me with your fingers if you think the top one is correct with the number 1, or if you think the bottom one is correct with the number 2. Okay, good. Number 1, that's right. So obviously then, you guys know this, it seems, so good for you guys, bravo. You always separate that O out as a combining vowel, and then we see at the bottom of it, we actually have the combining form. So this part here is what combines that word root and that combining vowel, if you recall from what we discussed yesterday. So looking at some body structure terms as it refers to oncological terminology. Lots of different terms here. So here we can start to see how we're building them together though. So this very first one you hear in the big box on the left, it's got a little bit easier for you guys to read. So we'll stay there knowing that that box on the right is just more and more examples of what you're seeing on the left. So that first term, cytogenic, okay, we kind of already talked about that. Genic, meaning like Genesis, a new formation of, and then cyto, meaning the cell. So cytogenic meaning producing cells. Cytoid, so we've got cyte again for cell, and that oid meaning a resemblance, so we get the resemblance of cells. And cytology, which we've used a little bit ago, ology being the study of, and then cyte being the study of cells. So you'll continue to just kind of use that same principle moving from right to left in most cases in order to figure out how we are understanding these terms. The hard part of this is, you know, they're throwing like 100, 200 words at you every chapter. And some of them have prefixes and suffixes that are new. Some of them are being reused. What you'll start to find as we continue to move through, the course should get a little bit easier for you the further we go, because we start reusing a lot of these word roots and just adding different suffixes or different prefixes to them. And we start reusing the suffixes and the prefixes as well, just adding them to different word roots. So as we move through each different chapter, we're moving through different systems of the body. That's where we're going to get new word roots that we're just going to sort of plug in. And it's good to then memorize and understand what those word roots are, but then we're either going to add a suffix or a prefix to it, and that's going to change how we apply that word root. But that's going to start to become a little bit more familiar to you as long as you kind of put in the work now to understand those prefixes and suffixes so that we can apply them and recycle them over and over down the road. So here's an exercise that comes out of your text and should be on page 35, exercise E. And here it's showing us the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland is on top of the kidney. And if we look at the word adrenal, we see that the word renal is its root, okay? And then the adrenal, meaning up above the kidney. So renal is the root word for kidney. And then if we have an excessive development of that kidney, we're seeing then a hyperplasia of the adrenal gland. And so the word hyper meaning excessive, plasia meaning development. So as you work through these different exercises, you should have to go back and look up some of these prefixes and some of these roots. Okay, unless you've got a photographic memory, you're going to have to do that. That should be the expectation, that you would need that. Don't feel bad about that. Don't be hesitant about that. That's normal, especially the first half of this course until some of this stuff becomes a little bit more recurring and you're using it more often. But the more you can start using these terms in every day, the better you're going to be with them. So I would encourage you to use them as much as possible. If you have the ability to download your those audio lectures that are listed in the Moodle, if you can download them to a spot that you can access them from your mobile phone and then listen to them on in your headphones, or just even from your laptop. Now, if you've got family members around, they're probably going to throw things at you because it's not exactly stimulating content for other people that aren't learning this. That's why I recommend the headphones. But if you can do that, then just listen to it. And that just listening is going to help it become regular and available to you. And then pretty soon you'll be starting to use parts of these words in sentences, and the people around you will be like, what are you talking about? Like, what does that even mean? And you'll have to then, good opportunity to educate them and explain to them, but also to kind of say, hey, I'm learning this stuff. That's a good thing because I'm just naturally using them. Complementary terms. So the complementary terms then are, and we're still building these from word parts. So we're still talking about like the Greek and Latin. So this is the category 1 from chapter 1 types of words. We're still building them from word parts, but they're complementary terms in that they are maybe not specifically telling you exactly what's going on, but they're added to other medical terms to complement them. And some examples of that would be obviously the ones listed there on the left, which are larger, but diagnosis, okay, that's a good one. We say, well, what is the diagnosis? That medical term is just telling us, okay, well, what's the knowledge of the disease? What's the identification of the disease? But it's used in or as a complement to actually revealing what the disease is. So if you had a hypertrophied right heart, okay, so the right ventricle of your heart is hypertrophied. Hyper and trophy meaning a excessive enlargement or excessive growth of the right ventricle. Hypertrophy, then so the diagnosis would be a hypertrophied right heart. Now we would bundle all of that together, and the medical term we would use for that is cor pulmonale, C-O-R space P-U-L-M-O-N-A-L-E, pulmonale, which don't worry about writing it down or looking it up. probably will discuss that in chapter 5, talking about the respiratory system. But cor pulmonale is a single word that we use to describe the disease of a hypertrophied right heart. And it basically is just when you have pulmonary hypertension in your lungs, in the arteries and veins in your lungs, the pressure inside those vessels is so high that when the right heart is pumping up into the lungs, it has to go against such large pressure that it creates a larger right heart muscle. And so therefore it gets hypertrophied. It grows excessively larger. So that's just kind of one example of a complementary term. Cyanosis is another common one, where if your patient is running low on oxygen, oftentimes their fingertips will kind of have a bluish hue. Sometimes their lips, their mucous membranes will have a bluish hue to them. That's called cyanosis. Looking at the list on the left, prognosis would be, as it says there, the state of before knowledge or prediction or the outcome of the disease. So if we say, well, what is the prognosis? That's what is our prediction of what's going to be the outcome of this disease. Most of the time we see that used as, okay, when we're doing medical research, we would say, what's the prognosis of a patient with this disease state? And then they would give you a percentage of this percentage of patients either contract full-blown cancer or this percentage of patients do not. Right now, when talking about this coronavirus, we could say people that get the coronavirus or signs and symptoms of the coronavirus, is the prognosis that they end up in ICU on a ventilator, or is the prognosis that they self-quarantine at home and they're able to recover from it? So two different examples of a prognosis. If I thought this certain patient is going to end up in the ICU, that would be my prognosis. I could also say that 18% of patients that are getting signs and symptoms of the coronavirus end up going to the hospital to seek care. That would be stating a prognosis as a percentage, and kind of gets into a little bit of an epidemiology, which we're not going to go into that term at this point, but it basically just means what is the rate of diseases throughout the population. Then we see some terms that are not built from words or word parts. So this is now category 2 from chapter 1, where we're out of the Greek and Latin, and we're looking at those other words like the eponyms that are from people's names or places. Also the modern language, just English uses of these, or looking at acronyms. So these are all examples of that. For example, malignant. Malignant, you're not going to be able to break that down going from right to left based off of its word parts. You're not going to be able to structure it and separate it using the dashes in order to figure out what that means. So looking back to that chart in chapter 1, how do we then learn these words? We have to use them. We just have to memorize them. And some of them they'll kind of just make sense. Like if you say chemotherapy, probably everybody's heard of chemotherapy and they understand what that means. Benign, not everybody's heard of benign. Apoptosis, not everybody's heard of apoptosis, okay? It basically means cell death or a programmed cell death. It's the end of most cells. But if nobody uses that word out at the market, no one's like, oh yeah, I had some apoptosis of my hair follicle. Like people don't talk like that, right? So, but that's the type of stuff that in the medical community you will hear and you will start to use a little bit more frequently. So this type of stuff, you're just going to have to look this stuff up when you see it and start learning it and going over it. So how should you study for this? I recommend looking at this information in the book, reading through it, saying it out loud, and then writing it down. A simple exercise of here's the word, and then here's the definition of it. If you write it down, it will stick way better than if you just say it out loud or just read it. It takes more time, it takes more effort, yes, but it will help you learn it better. The way I prefer to study is I read and I highlight, and then after I'm done doing that, I go back again, and then I will write down the term, and then I won't write down the entire full definition that I highlighted, but I'll write down the definition in my own words. Because if I write it down in my words, I'm going to remember it that much easier than if I write it down in the words of the book or the author. Now, sometimes it's necessary to use specific terms the author uses. Other times we can get away with using our own terms so that we can understand it better. But I always tell my respiratory therapy students this, that you don't really know it unless you can teach it. And I have students that do a pretty good job on exams. I can ask them a question, they can raise their hand and they can answer the question. But when I ask them, okay, now you explain this topic or this concept to the other student, all of a sudden it's just like blank. And they start talking through it and they just can't get the words out. If I explain it to them, they're like, oh yeah, yes, I understand. But then when they try to teach it back, they simply can't do it. And so I always tell them, you don't know it until you can teach it. And then that's going to guarantee that you can get that word out. The other thing is, sometimes on tests, it's presented in a way that's presented different than it was in class, using a slightly different pattern of words or a different order of words. And if you don't know it to the point where you can teach it, that can throw you off and cause you to do poorly on an exam. Whereas if you know it in your own words and you understand it, even if it's presented differently, you can say, wait a minute, here's what they're doing. This is what they're saying. I know what that is. This is the answer. So yes, it takes more time. Yes, it's more work, but it will pay dividends for you in the future. And then things become easier in learning as you've done that, but it does take that effort up front. Okay, so we're just about to the end here, looking at common plural endings. So again, not built from Greek or Latin, but we see the endings like a or ax or is, or e's, aces, like thoraces. So there's more of those on page 49 of your text to see more of that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through that. Again, here, these are more or less just to make it easier to say for us. They don't necessarily have a huge major meaning. Thus, they're not listed as suffixes, such like ik and us were in the previous sections. And here's a kind of an example of how those are going to be used. And I think we're just about the end of the slides here, but the last thing then is abbreviations. And we talked about that as far as acronyms in chapter 1. And abbreviations in the medical field are huge. We use them all of the time. Why? Because these words that we're learning are hard to say, they're harder to spell, and most people don't want to write them out all of the time. Plus, if we're walking around with a sheet of paper that's got 25 patients on it, we don't have room to write out all of our words. So just about everything we do ends up being acronyms. So you really have your own shorthand way of speaking when you write things out in a literal fashion with abbreviations, and most of them end up being acronyms. So, for example, CTOS. You guys remember what the C, T, O, and S from earlier today was? You know, body structure, C, cell, builds up to T, tissue, builds up to O, organs, builds up to S, systems, CTOS. So that acronym is helping me know and learn the systematic hierarchy of the body structure. The abbreviations that are listed here are common. By no way is this exhaustive. This is just a small subset of some of the abbreviations that we see used in this chapter. But for example, CA for cancer. On our sheets, as a respiratory therapist, we see patients with lung cancer all the time. So we write lung CA for lung cancer. Chemo, that's just what we say. You have chemo today? You know, it's not that much extra work to say chemotherapy, but we all just say chemo. DX for diagnosis, PX for prognosis, RX for prescriptions, HX for history, TX for treatments. You'll see all of those types of things used in medical. RBC, red blood cell, WBC, white blood cell, and so on. So to summarize, here's the items we went over, and we just summarized CETOS, so we're not going to do that again. But that completes chapter 2.